Coming up on today's Eastern Conference edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, we have a new Stanley Cup champion. The Vegas Golden Knights have defeated the Florida Panthers in 5 games, and the Panthers, wait till you hear their injury list. We'll go through that and what lessons can be learned from Vegas's run to the Stanley Cup final. Today's episode is brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook. It's the official sportsbook of Locked On. You can make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. This is the Locked On NHL podcast. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen on this Wednesday, June 14th. Shout out to the everydayers out there. We are free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts. So make sure you like, subscribe, rate 5 stars, and make sure you're following on Twitter as well, Locked On Network. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me at Locked On Senators 5 days a week. And today I'm joined by a very special guest. It's Gil Martin over at Locked On Islanders. Gil, it's been a while since we've had a nice conversation. I love the new background, real sharp. How's your summer going so far?
It's going. I can't believe there's no live hockey now for a few months, but nice, Stanley Cup champions awarded, and it's always great to see those guys skating around with the cup. It's always a special moment.
My favorite's the order. You're always wondering, speculating who's going to get it. Of course, we knew the misfits, the 6 remaining players from the inaugural 2018 team was going to get it after Mark Stone, which I was feeling a little emotional about, knowing that he was a 6th-round draft pick of the Ottawa Senators way back when, and just watching him develop into a leader, gets a hat trick in the clinching game, just storybook stuff from Mark Stone, but he passes it first to Riley Smith, who's worn the A for all 6 seasons there. And then it goes to Marchessault and William Karlsson and Braden McNabb, Shea Theodore, and Will Carrier, the 6 original Golden Knights. Super impressive to see their rise. I don't want to say to prominence because they've made 4 conference finals, and this is the second time the cup's been paraded around T-Mobile Arena ice. Hey, Chandler Stevenson was holding it both times, first with Washington back in 2018 and then up in 2023. But in terms of a competitiveness standpoint, you probably could have hoped for a closer series, hey?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly, if you're not a fan of either team, you want to see it go at least 6. I mean, that's just, you want to see a more competitive series. But when you look at all the injuries that the Panthers were dealing with, it is not surprising that it wasn't able to go more than 5.
Where do you want to start? Matthew Tkachuk, probably the biggest absence in 5, and sounds like Brady Tkachuk had to help him out of bed after his pregame nap, game 4. Matthew Tkachuk, this reported by John Buccigross from ESPN, that he played with a fractured sternum, which does not sound very comfortable.
The getting out of bed part with a fractured sternum doesn't sound very comfortable, let alone trying to play a competitive game of Stanley Cup final hockey. So, yeah, the will of these guys to even give it a shot is so impressive.
He almost scored the game-tying goal in game 4.
Yes.
It didn't stop him from going to the net, and that's kind of the Tkachuk zone, you could say, is that 5 feet from the goal line out. But a remarkable feat of strength, bravery, you could even say, for him. And Paul Maurice went so far as saying that his teammates had to help him put his equipment on. Like, he literally could not bend in certain directions. And you got to think how much Toradol he's taken and all these things to kind of make sure that he can even step on the ice. So for him to miss game 5, you knew that it was serious, serious stuff. But it didn't end there. You hear Aaron Ekblad has been playing with a broken foot for the last month.
It's unbelievable. And yet he plays through it. And, if nobody told you, would you know? I mean, it's just unbelievable what these guys are willing to sacrifice in order to try to get their name etched in, on Lord Stanley's silver chalice there. And I'm sure this isn't the complete list. I'm sure over the next week or so, some more names will trickle out as to who was playing hurt on both teams. And it's just a mentality that hockey players have.
It certainly is. And some would say, you know what, is this smart for the long-term implications? I have time to hear that, especially when it comes to head injuries. And I think they have done a much better job in terms of the concussion spotters and trying to at least get an initial diagnosis on that and holding guys out for concussions. But I mean, a broken sternum is a broken sternum. It's going to heal. It's a broken bone, right? So from that standpoint, it's how much pain can you tolerate? I don't think in 30 years, Matthew Tkachuk's going to be like, man, that extra game was the difference between me getting out of bed as a 60-year-old man every morning. But it's the resilience. And you would have to take away their gear to stop these guys from going onto the ice at a certain point because they are so driven and they've come so far. They've gone through so much and they're so close, closer than they ever have been to winning a Stanley Cup. And stick taps the Florida Panthers, man. They ran through these playoffs ever since going down 3-1 to the Boston Bruins in round one. I believe they were 11-2 throughout the next while, or 11-1, because then they lost game 1, 2, and well, then game 4 of the Stanley Cup final. Right. And it all fell apart once they got, like, I got to see Vegas twice this postseason when they played up in Winnipeg, where I'm residing these days. And you just saw it with them. Every game, it was a different line that would kill you. And to me, that's the lesson learned here is that, yeah, you need your top end talents, and they have that in spades. Sorry for the little Vegas card reference there, but with Jack Eichel, with Mark Stone, and everyone else just fits in so perfectly underneath that. Like, they've got 4 lines, 60. Everyone can play. They're not protecting anybody. Whereas when Florida, especially with Matthew Tkachuk, but even before that, their 4th line was getting 6-7 minutes a game.
Yeah, and, you know, that takes a toll. The deeper you go into a series, the deeper you go into the playoffs, guys start to wear down. We saw the injuries taking place. When the minutes are more evenly distributed, the odds of that kind of injury are reduced because everyone's not getting overworked, they're not getting overtaxed. And the idea that depth that you spoke about, where every night it's a different line or a different player, you know, that makes it harder for the other team to say, okay, if we take away this player, we can control we have a good chance of winning the game. So, you know, if you take away Stone, then there's another player, then it's Eichel, then it's, you know, they even had, you know, 3rd pair defensemen chipping in offensively during the final series. I believe it was in game 3, if I'm not, or 4, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I mean, the idea that everybody has their role and everybody steps up and does it really can wear down the opposition. And I think it really did that in this series.
Just a fantastic team put together by George McPhee and Kelly McCrimmon, the GM, president of hockey ops with the Vegas Golden Knights. I thought it was kind of funny after the game. George McPhee didn't seem too impressed, but I love the move that Bruce Cassidy started the 5 original Vegas Golden Knights to start the game. They got hemmed in their own zone, but I did think it was kind of a cool ode to what they've been building. And Bill Foley, the owner of the Vegas Golden Knights, was on record at the expansion draft saying, we need playoffs by year 3 and a cup by year 6. Well, it's been 6 seasons, and the Vegas Golden Knights have won the Stanley Cup. Jonathan Marchessault is the Conn Smythe Trophy winner, an incredible postseason for him. And that was after, like, he didn't do much in that Winnipeg series, which just goes to my point that each series, each game, it was someone different that was stepping up. He certainly found the goal scoring afterwards, but in the series against Winnipeg, 2 assists, no goals. He actually didn't score his first goal of the postseason until game 3 against Edmonton. It took 8 games to get his first goal. He happened to get his second one in that game as well. And then it was gangbusters from the Dallas series on, really, or even the hat trick he scored in the clinching game 6 against Edmonton. That was just remarkable ascent for him. So Jonathan Marchessault, your Conn Smythe Trophy winner, he finishes the postseason with 13 goals and 25 points in 22 games. So stick taps are in order for Jonathan Marchessault. And do you think, Gil, that it even becomes sweeter for him? The team that he beat in the final was the one that literally paid to give him away in the expansion draft. Like, that had to be a little extra sweet for him.
It's icing on the cake. I mean, you want to win the Stanley Cup no matter who you're playing against, but when you do it that way, it's just a little extra joy to be found in that moment.
Jack Eichel, in his first NHL Stanley Cup playoffs, leads the playoffs in scoring with 26 points in 22 game. Super impressive all around for the Vegas Golden Knights. We'll have more on that next. And some of the top storylines around the Eastern Conference as we head 2 weeks right now until Connor Bedard and the rest of the top draft picks for 2023 hear their name called in Nashville. That's next. You're listening to Locked On NHL. Today's episode is brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook. It is time to get the no sweat first bet. You can get it at $1,000, up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. So just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from money line to point scores and threes drained. And something I like is futures, because then you just have your rooting interest so you can get further into the game with that. Plus, you can do same game parlays at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance at the no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel. It's the official sports betting partner of the NBA and the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, you're listening to Locked On NHL. I'm Ross Levitan. For more on what we've been dealing with over at Locked On Senders, you can go find that on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And the team's been sold finally. Now we turn our attention to what's happening on the ice. Did I see over at Locked On Islanders you're trying to steal Alex DeBrincat?
Not trying to steal him, but certainly said he would check a lot of boxes for the needs of the Islanders. Unfortunately, salary cap is going to make that a tight squeeze if the Islanders could possibly pull it off. I think he would be the ideal fit for what this team needs, but how to get there would be a little problematic. I mean, what do you think that would be asked for in return?
How about Ilya Sorokin? Cool.
Conversation over.
Yeah, unbelievable, man, how good he is. But Ottawa, I think at the end of the day, needs a goalie. Now, the thing is, are they going to be able to get something that they can then flip and turn into a goalie? But to me, it's you got to get a goalie here in a move, whether it's for DeBrincat or using the assets you get back. And I know that there's not a whole lot of draft capital down there on Long Island. So I do think it would be maybe a little bit difficult to make that sort of trade. And I don't think that that there's too many trade chips. I don't know what Lou, like where are the Islanders at? What's the biggest storyline for you with the Islanders going into next season? Or this offseason, rather.
Yeah, right now it's that Lou Lamoriello is back, Lane Lambert is back as coach, and the core is probably going to remain intact. So a lot of fans kind of frustrated by that because the team needs to get a little younger, a little faster, and a little more skilled. And but the cap constraints and Lou Lamoriello coming back, I don't know if they're going to do any of those things this offseason.
And the one thing you do know when it comes to Lou Lamoriello is that you're not going to know anything.
Right, until it happens. Yeah, exactly.
So that makes speculating very interesting. Whereas, like, we had Pierre Doria on the show 2 weeks ago. What would you put the percentages at of Lou Lamoriello coming on Locked On Islanders?
Oh, 0. Negative 2, you know? I mean,
he wouldn't even go on the official broadcast partner of the Leafs when he was in Toronto, right?
Exactly.
So that's just not Lou's style. He moves in silence. Lou Lamoriello does. So very interesting times ahead for the New York Islanders, who just missed the playoffs this season, and next season, yes.
But we were in.
Oh, sorry, man. It was so quick. I almost
we lost in 6 in the first round to Carolina.
My goodness. I actually think, guys, maybe that's why I'm upset. As I was saying, I was like, no, that's not right. Because I remember eyeing you guys for that final wild card spot.
Right.
You sneak in. It's Pittsburgh that goes out. But Carolina, man, I bet against them in the first and second round. Then I said, you know what? I'm getting on the island. I'm getting on the Hurricanes for round 3. They're going to do it. And then, so I'm just the overall mush. So I don't know a damn thing. If you haven't figured that out by now, here you are. But the vibes are high here on Locked On NHL. We appreciate everyone who makes us their first listen each and every day. But what I will say, and here, this is how I'll save myself here. The Islanders, I think internally probably a little disappointed with how things finished overall in this season, especially after kind of making that move for my goodness. Bo Horvat. I knew there was a Brock Nelson, Bo Horvat. These names are so similar here. But with Bo Horvat coming in next year, Like, how did he fare? Like, are you happy now that looking back, like that's 17th overall, it was around there that, that the draft pick's going to end up being? You still feel like that's worthwhile with the extension in place?
The problem is that he did not perform up to expectations after the trade. And there could be a number of reasons for it. And I think the biggest one, Matthew Barzal got injured 6-7 games after the trade was made, didn't play the rest of the regular season. And he just didn't have the line mates to truly shine. But he's going to have to produce somewhere closer to the way he produced in Vancouver to make the trade worthwhile. I think it was a good move. I don't think the Islanders get into the playoffs at all without the Bo Horvat trade. But now they've traded away their first round pick in 4 consecutive drafts. That's not a pattern that I like.
That's wild. But they have had some deep playoff runs to show for it.
Yes. Couple of conference finals appearances. They've made the playoffs 4 of the last 5 years, won at least a series in 3 of those 4. But the concern for a lot of fans on the island is that this core group, you got 12 players over 30. They've maxed out their, upside potential. They're only going to start getting older and slowing down, and there's nothing left in the system to replenish that talent base.
Which is, that's where you need these young kids on entry level to step in and kind of make that next push. But with Ilya Sorokin, man, anything's possible when you have a goal.
That's the flip side. Yeah.
So more on New York Islanders hockey over at Locked On Islanders. Like, subscribe, go check them out on Twitter and on YouTube, wherever you download your podcast. But coming up next, we're going to dissect the season that was for the Florida Panthers. And for more on the Florida Panthers and Vegas Golden Knights, a reminder that Locked On has shows on every single team. It's local experts on the biggest stories every single weekday. Those guys over at Locked On Golden Knights, I was hate watching them this morning. They're so happy. They're so happy.
You wouldn't be if the Senators won the cup. You wouldn't be happy.
Yeah, but I've suffered. They haven't suffered enough. They just come in, they win. And everyone chirped them after the expansion draft. So you have to give the management group credit. Maybe it's a little easier to get guys to stay in a place like Vegas. And by all accounts, Vegas is much more than just the strip, right? They've got the great neighborhoods, great weather, great tax brackets, all those things. So it's a little easy. I think they do have a bit of a competitive advantage where they are. But you know what? They made the most of it. And they did it with what? They're going into the season. I know Robin Lehner, everyone knew he was going to be out for the year. But they end up wasn't Robin Lehner. It wasn't Laurent Brossoit. It wasn't even Jonathan Quick, who they picked up as an insurance at the deadline. It was Adin Hill who comes in and wins the Stanley Cup for Vegas. But on the flip side, what does it mean for the Florida Panthers, who sneaked into the final playoff spot in the Eastern Conference and went on a run unparalleled to they've ever had before, winning 1 Stanley Cup final game, which they got swept their only other time in the final. So they're able to add another notch higher. What's next for the Florida Panthers? We'll discuss here on Locked On NHL. Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen. The everydayers out there, we appreciate you for tuning in and hearing your favorite teams and leagues all across the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. And we had Armando. I need to give a ton of credit to it for. This guy absolutely crushed the Florida Panthers coverage this year. He was credentialed at games, boots on the ground, and we want to give some stick taps to him. And I know you've had a couple deeper playoff runs. We've been doing this for 4 years, Gil, and I haven't even sniffed playoffs yet for the Ottawa Senators standpoint.
You guys are close. Guys are close.
I'm just jealous. Our biggest moments have been trades, reacting to those, and I need playoffs in my life. But whether your team is aiming for playoffs or the draft, you can go check out your favorite show here on Locked On NHL. I know injuries played a part. We led with that when it comes to the Eastern Conference, and we're going to focus on that. The West and the Vegas Golden Knights Locked On shows will cover in depth what's going on with VGK in that Stanley Cup championship. But with Florida, is it kind of going to be a feeling of what if when it comes to the health of certain players, where maybe we could have given them a better fight? Because They swept the Carolina Hurricanes. No matter what Rod Brindamore will tell you, they swept that series. They made a mockery. They lost one game to the Toronto Maple Leafs after it felt like the Leafs were going to open the floodgates, finally getting over that hump and winning one round of the series. It wasn't the case. So I have a ton of respect for what Paul Maurice, what Sergei Bobrovsky, what Matthew Tkachuk, and their depth guys. Like Nick Cousins had some big moments. Sam Bennett had big moments. Like, I think that they should be looking in the mirror and being pretty proud of what they accomplished as an 8 seed.
Absolutely. And, if you take a step back, here's a team that won the President's Trophy a year ago, and a lot of offseason changes. You don't expect a lot of changes after you have the best record in the league. Took them some time to gel. A very big gamble bringing Tkachuk in after you win the President's Trophy and making fundamental changes to your top guys, and yet they did it, got off to a slow start, made the adjustments, and then, as you said, went on this huge playoff run. And great coaching and great determination. They stepped up at the right time. And I think it shows a lot of heart on the part of the Florida Panthers, and it also speaks to how tight this league is, that the difference between missing the playoffs altogether for the Florida Panthers was 1 point, and yet they were able to go on a run all the way to the Stanley Cup final.
And I know it's been documented, but that 1 point being the Chicago Blackhawks winning against the Pittsburgh Penguins in a meaningless game for them, for Chicago, but ultimately getting them Connor Bedard based on the percentage and the chances. So Pittsburgh misses the playoffs. Chicago gets Connor Bedard, all because of one night in the regular season. It really is kind of prophetic in a sense, but when you look back, it is remarkable that so much can change on one instant, and 1 point being the difference for them in Florida. And how about Alex Lyon leading them into the playoffs, and then Sergei Bobrovsky being like, hey, why don't I just play like a $10 million goalie again? He was fantastic. Like, if we're doing it, I know the Conn Smythe always goes to the best players on the winning team, and like Marchessault wins the Conn Smythe, but they could have easily made a case for Jack Eichel, for Mark Stone. Hell, Aiden Hill only played 3 of the series. I know Laurent Brossoit beat his old team in Winnipeg, but like you could make a case Aiden Hill deserves some credit. He made some remarkable saves in his run. But if we're looking at the Florida Panthers, how would your Conn Smythe voting have gone had the Panthers won? Or maybe we'll go with the first 3 rounds, the series that they did win. Like, is it a 2-horse race, or are there some other guys in there for you?
Well, I think you got to start with Tkachuk. I think so many clutch goals, overtime game winners, late third period game tires. I think he stepped up his game. And then when you hear about the injury at the end, it just makes it even more remarkable what he was able to accomplish. Certainly Bobrovsky has to be in that equation. And, there are other players, but those two, I think, stand head and shoulders above the rest. Who were some of your dark horses?
Well, the dark horses is just that, because I'm with you that the number 1 and number 2 has to be, I would go Bobrovsky number 1, just because Matthew Tkachuk wouldn't have had the moments he did if Bobrovsky didn't keep them in games the way he did. Some more clutch goals were from Carter Verhaeghe in that playoffs. I thought he was brilliant. Now, there was a bit of a dip in the middle for Brandon Montour, but for him, like they don't get out of the first round if it wasn't for Brandon Montour. So he would get a little bit of respect for me in this conversation. And yeah, other than that, I'd probably go Carter Verhaeghe. Just the fact that it just felt like if it wasn't Tkachuk, it was going to be Verhaeghe that stepped up. He had 2 game winners, including Game 7 overtime against the Boston Bruins. So for me, like, none of this run happens if it isn't for those guys. But this is me giving dark horses because the light, the shine should be on Matthew Tkachuk and Sergei Bobrovsky. But what's next for the Florida Panthers? Paul Maurice went out and said last night, we've got some guys so banged up that they're not going to be able to start next season. Like, could we see a step back for the Florida Panthers? Because they're one of those teams, kind of like the Islanders and like a few other teams out there, where they've just said, to hell with the draft. We just want this best chance to win. They've traded away this year's first, next year's first. I'm pretty sure the year after as well. Like, they don't have draft picks coming. This is what you see is what you get. I'm nervous that if it's Matthew Tkachuk, if it's Aaron Ekblad, maybe other guys who we don't know the extent of their injuries, that it could be them battling for that 8th playoff spot again next year.
It is very possible, and it wouldn't surprise me if some of those players miss the beginning of the season, that they do get off to a little bit of a slow start. But you know what? They got off to a slow start this year also, and were able to pick it up in January and start doing their thing and gelling as a team. So the thing is, the Atlantic Division is very competitive. We talked about them making the playoffs by that 1 point. So yeah, they could do it again, but there's also a very small margin for error. And you've got young up-and-coming teams like your Ottawa Senators and the Buffalo Sabres and the Detroit Red Wings, who probably will be better this year.
And Boston won't die.
Boston's not going anywhere. They won't set records most likely again this year, but they're not necessarily going anywhere. And so it is not easy. And I think, that's part of the beauty of the National Hockey League, that the difference between 8th place and 11th place in the conference is what, 3-4 points? It's
one game. Like that's why
it's one game. It's one shootout puck that hits the post or goes in. It's one overtime loss. It's a fraction, and that makes it all much more exciting for the fans. No question about that.
What a game, what a series, what a playoffs, what a league. And we're very excited to cover it going forward. The next 2 weeks here on Locked On NHL, Wednesday edition, we're all draft now. It's off season. It's rumor mill season. It's churning. There's going to be a ton of movement if the cap is in fact only going up $1 million. Some teams kind of banked on the fact that it would go up higher. So what's going to happen? What kind of player movement? That's all coming up in the next couple of weeks on Locked On NHL. And on Mondays and Fridays, Gil Martin's your guy. What do we got coming up this Friday?
Well, we have our women's hockey spotlight, which we do every other week. And we will probably, I have to talk to Rachel Donner, my co-host, and see what we have planned. But
busy times in her land right now with the Flyers.
Yes, lot going on in Philly. We've got the sale of the Sens. So there's a lot of stuff going on around the league, some new coaches, new GMs. So we will definitely be on top of all of that.
Thank you for being an everydayer, and thank you for listening to Locked On NHL. We appreciate everyone for sticking with us. Local experts on the biggest stories. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Go check out Locked On Vegas Golden Knights, Locked On Florida Panthers. For Gil Martin from Locked On Islanders, from Locked On Senators, I'm Ross Levitan. Thank you for making us your first listen each and every day. We appreciate being a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.